So I got this question over on Facebook earlier, and it was basically, should I buy cheap hardware or good plugins? So the question kind of is cheap hardware, cheap compressors, cheap EQs versus normal standard EQs, compressors, plugins. Now, the simple answer to this is cheap hardware and plugins. The plugins are most probably going to sound better because the plugins, especially in emulation of the actual expensive hardware. Let's say, for instance, we've got an alpha compressor next door, £10,500 for a compressor. The plug-in version you can pick up for $29 on a sale at Plugin Alliance. The difference between the two is there's a lot of difference there, obviously, but it's not huge. It's not massive differences, right? It's not like that plugin is totally different to the hardware. They're very similar. Obviously, the hardware sounds brilliant and it sounds so much better than the plugin, but the plugin sounds great. Now, if you compared that hardware, the alpha compressor, to a cheap compressor, it's night and day. It's like, well, that one sounds terrible in comparison to the hardware. So, kind of to conclude on this, real quick and real simply, cheap compressors, cheap EQs, you're better off having plugins. Plugins will sound better than cheap hardware. Unless you go expensive. You compare expensive hardware to even expensive plugins, or just generally plugins. The hardware's better, but it's close enough in the plugin world. So if you were to choose between, let's say for argument's sake, a really cheap compressor, a DBX 166, I think, compressor. It's a real cheap compressor for, I think, about like £160 or something like that. £160 hardware compared to £160 compressor, or even a £50 plug-in compressor in a sale, the plugin's better. Believe me, the plugin's better. The only time you are going to want to have hardware is if you're tracking live, and even plugins can be used nowadays. If you wanted to track live or play live and have hardware, then it's going to have its place. But realistically, in a studio, if you're comparing cheap hardware to plugins, the plugins will win every time. Cheap hardware isn't that good. It's really not good because it is cheap. And like I said before, if you compare the cheap hardware to the really expensive hardware, it's night and day difference. But if you compare the plugin emulation to the expensive hardware, there's difference, but it's not in any way, shape or form massive. It's not massive like the jump between cheap hardware and expensive hardware. The other thing to bear in mind is when you're working with hardware, for instance, you've got the difference of converters and things like that, the signal chain, everything in between the before and after the actual compressor. That all factors into how good that compressor sounds. So let's say, for instance, you're using a cheap compressor through a cheap interface with cheap converters, it's going to sound considerably worse than plugins. So to answer your question, if you wanted to go out, if you had £400 to spend on plugins or £400 to spend on compressors and EQs, like Clark Technique EQs and compressors, they are shockingly bad. Don't even go near them. You'll have some people say, "Oh, but I've modded them." They're still terrible. They're just bad. Don't even go near them. So let's say, for instance, them versus a plugin. The plugin versions are much better. The plugins, just in general, are much better compared to cheap hardware.